All right, now that we've talked about how cells will use energy coupling to drive chemical reactions, we get a chance to talk a little bit about how cells use energy coupling to drive both transport across the membrane and mechanical cell work as well. So we'll start with transport. Some of this should be familiar from what we talked about in Chapter 7 when we were looking at membrane structure and function. So in this case, in the very top half of this image, we have an example of a transport protein. This transport protein is going to be a pump. It's going to be pumping molecules or ions, particles against their concentration gradient. This requires an input of energy by the cell. So the cell is going to use its ATP. It's going to hydrolyze the ATP, meaning it's going to break it. When it hydrolyzes the ATP, this is an exergonic reaction, energy gets released, and that energy is then used by the transport protein to change shape and flip to the other side so that the particle, molecule, ion, whatever it is, can be released to the other side where its concentration is already high. Very similar to chemical work, the way that ATP transfers the energy to the endergonic process is through direct phosphorylation, through the direct transfer of that last or terminal phosphate group from its tail onto some other substance. In this case, it's going to be the transport protein that receives that phosphate group. So when the ATP breaks, it becomes ADP. That phosphate gets put onto the transport protein that changes its shape chemically and physically so that the transport protein can now face the other side of the membrane, releasing the solute particle that it's trying to get to the other side. And then once that function is done, that phosphate group gets removed off of the transport protein. It's released as an inorganic phosphate, as you see here. And then the transport protein will return back to its original shape. And it can do this process over and over and over again, as long as there are solutes to move and there's ATP available to pay for that process. Now, as we start talking about mechanical work, things are a little bit different down here. We're not going to go into as much detail here as we did, for example, with chemical work. When you get to anatomy and physiology, if you go on to take that course, you will learn a lot about muscle contraction. And in that case, you will see exactly how ATP in a complex fashion is going to be used to drive that kind of mechanical work. Here we're going to do a little bit of hand waving. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about maybe not the contraction of muscles, but we're going to talk about movement of motor proteins down cytoskeletal elements in the cell, transporting a vesicle from one part to another part of the cell. This is mechanical work, and this requires an input of ATP, as you see here. The difference here in driving mechanical work, though, from transport and chemical work is that nothing gets directly phosphorylated. Nothing receives that phosphate group from the ATP. It's a slightly more complex process, but just know that every time one of these feet on the motor protein decide to pick themselves up, move themselves one step over, that requires a molecule of ATP to get that process going. So a lot of ATP is going to be used to get that motor protein to move the vesicle down the cytoskeletal element in the cell. So cells have to use a lot of ATP, right? They don't stop, they don't sleep. They're constantly driving chemical reactions, transporting materials, doing mechanical work. So every time a cell needs to drive one of these processes, it'll use ATP, right? And so let's just review a little bit. Here's our ATP. And to release energy from the ATP, right, the cell will break the ATP. And when it breaks the ATP, what's left behind is ADP plus the inorganic phosphate. Now, this process we talked about is exergonic, right? So when you break the ATP, you release energy. Well, the cell is going to have to figure out how to make more and more and more ATP if it wants to survive, right? So it constantly has that supply of energy to drive all the processes it needs to maintain a living state. So think about it for a second. Looking at the chemical equation that I drew here, what would be the easiest, the path of least resistance way for a cell to make more ATP? Do you think it's going to want to just start building from scratch, adding carbons and oxygens and hydrogens and phosphorus atoms to build a new ATP? Probably not, right? That would take a lot of work and a lot of energy. So what would be the easiest way for a cell to make more ATP? Hopefully you're thinking, well, instead of going this direction, why doesn't the cell just take the ADP that it's got floating around and the inorganic phosphates and stitch them back together, right? And go in the opposite direction. And that is in fact exactly what the cell does. However, to go in the opposite direction, to take ADP and the inorganic phosphate to make ATP, do you think this is going to be an endergonic reaction requiring an input of energy, or is it going to be an exergonic reaction releasing energy? I hope that you picked endergonic, right? To build a more complex, more energy-rich molecule like ATP, you're going to have to supply some energy, right? So in this case, energy is going to have to go in. I'm going to ask a more difficult question. Where does this energy come from to make more ATP in a cell? That might be hard to think about. Let me ask it a slightly different way. Where do you get your energy from? Hopefully you're telling me, well, from the food that I eat, right? You eat because you need that energy, you need the nutrients to build more of you or to maintain more of you. Well, the reason why you eat and particularly consume energy-rich molecules like carbohydrates or fats is because what your body does then is it takes those molecules and it breaks them down. It breaks them down through catabolic processes, which typically involve a lot of exergonic reactions, releasing a lot of energy. So when your body breaks down a glucose molecule, right, this is an exergonic process, it releases energy, and that energy then is going to be used here to take ADPs and inorganic phosphates, link them back together to make ATP. All right, so another way of looking at this though is on this next slide here. So ATP has to be a renewable resource, right? The cell needs a lot of ATP to maintain a living state, to pay for all those cellular processes. And so what I drew in the sketchbook, this is shown in a slightly different version here on this slide. So in this case, let's walk through it. We've got ATP here and water. This is showing you the process of hydrolysis, right? In the presence of water, ATP is broken down to ADP and the inorganic phosphate, and this releases a whole bunch of energy. And that energy is used to do cellular work, right? To drive endergonic, energy-consuming processes like chemical work, transport work, and mechanical work. Now, the cell then will take the leftover ADP and inorganic phosphates, and it wants to remake ATP so it could do more cellular work. Now, to take the ADP and the organic phosphate to make more ATP, right, this is an endergonic process, requires an input of energy, and the energy here that goes in to drive the production of ATP comes from catabolism, comes from taking the food that you eat, breaking it down, releasing that energy, and funneling that energy into a process that makes ATP. This right here on the left-hand side, this is cellular respiration. This is what we're going to be focusing on in chapter 9.